Well, if you were on a tight budget, as many people in this country are, surely, what kinds of things would you prioritize, and how would that change the way that you approach grocery shopping?
I think that going to a wholesale retailer can be really great if someone's able to afford like buying a larger amount of, even if they're getting organic chicken. And I also think that it's really, if you can't afford to buy organic, just buying real foods is the most important when it comes down to it. So sometimes people might not have the incentive to buy fruits and vegetables because they're like, oh, it's not organic, so I'm not going to buy them. But eating fruits and vegetables is so important to get those antioxidants, the phytonutrients, the fiber that completely change your gene expression and your microbiome that belong on every single person's plate. So I would say that doing more of the like wholesale retailers, that you would be surprised. The prices aren't that different when it comes down to it. If you're going there compared to like a Kroger to buy something like chicken, like an organic chicken from a wholesale retailer compared to chicken at something like a Kroger. And then, like I said, I would do a lot of canned beans and lentils because it's an amazing source of protein, fiber, micronutrients that is extremely affordable and filling, very satiating. And you can add different like sauces and things like that to make them taste better for kids. I also think that the earlier that you expose your kids to these things, the more open-minded that they are to them. In addition to that, frozen vegetables, because frozen vegetables are going to be more affordable than fresh. Typically, they're less expensive and they also have a longer shelf life, so you're not going to be wasting food. And then in addition to that, like frozen fruit would be the same category for that reason. I think even like cottage cheese can be a good option. Yogurt can be a good option. Like all of these foods, it doesn't need to be anything crazy. I think most people argue, oh, it's about affordability when it's really comes down to education. And I'll tell you that when I was getting my master's in public health nutrition, I was in North Carolina at the state health department, and my project that I chose for myself was the farmers markets and looking at the redemption rates. So in the Women, Infants, and Children program, which is one of the government programs that they pay for food vouchers for the women that are at federal poverty guidelines, and they give them money towards different foods that they can buy. And they would give them extra money for the farmers market. So it was vouchers that they had on this North Carolina state program where they would get extra vouchers. And when I was looking at all of the data, they only had 48% redemption rates at the farmers market. So that means that 52% of people that can't afford food were getting free money for food to go to the farmers market, and they weren't there.
Interesting. They just weren't using it.
They didn't use it.
Wow.
And you would think like if it really came down to not being able to afford, then you would utilize the free money that you were being given. That's why I think it's much larger than just money. It's about education. It's about teaching them. We looked into like the bus routes to see, could it just be that the bus wasn't routing to the farmers market, so they didn't have transportation, which the bus routes actually did. We looked at whether there was enough clarity around whether the farmer stands at the farmers market accepted the vouchers in multiple languages, so that if someone only spoke Spanish, that they understood and they weren't intimidated by being able to walk up to the farmer's booth to be able to look at it. All of it was pretty clearly outlined. So it wasn't fully clear why 52% of people weren't utilizing the free money that they were being given for the fruits and vegetables.
Maybe it's just that the fruits and vegetables don't taste as good as hyper-palatable, ultra-processed foods.
And they aren't as convenient. It does take extra time. So I think people need to, because it does take the extra time and the extra attention, and people, don't have a lot of that, they have to understand the benefits,
Yeah.
And they're not really being taught the benefits by anyone.
Yeah. Even one of the, I think, better points made by that Time magazine article was that even within the bucket of ultra-processed foods, not all ultra-processed foods are created equally. And I think right now we have a really sort of low-resolution understanding that ultra-processed foods generally are not good for you. But would you agree that even within that bucket, some are probably more benign than others?
And that makes it more complicated and is the benefit of the food industry, where they're able to make more of an argument around the fact that you can't just label all of them the same. Of course, they're going to have a million arguments in their favor, and I do believe that would be one, and why they're trying to incorporate a recommendation around ultra-processed foods for the dietary guidelines for Americans coming up for 2025 to 2030. It'll be interesting to see whether the committee actually makes any recommendations, and then whether they actually listen to them, because I don't know if you remember when the Dietary Advisory Committee is our country's nutrition experts that are appointed by the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services. So the committee reviews all of the research that's come out over the last 5 years to then make any new cases for changes in the guidelines. So that's why, like, we saw the recommendation that was added this past round to say that added sugar should not be consumed for kids under 2. That was like a new one that they added. The committee actually recommended 6% added sugar consumption, 6% of calories. They recommended decreasing it from 10% to 6% because
for
they
what, for
felt
children or adults?
For adults, because they felt that there was enough evidence to make that recommendation, which they have to have a lot of evidence to do that. And the USDA and the Department of Human Services ignored it, and they didn't publish that in the guidelines. So they don't have to listen to the committee that they appoint, which most of them obviously have a large bias because a lot of them are receiving money from pharma and food, the food industry, and up until this past time, like, really don't have to disclose it. And still, it's very, very murky, where you don't fully understand the depth of their financial ties and their conflicts of interest. Yeah. So they just chose to not publish it.
Wow.
Also, I think that. So my experience with the dietary guidelines dates back to 2014 when I was in Washington, D.C. at the Dietary Advisory Guidelines meeting prior to the release of the 2015 guidelines. This was like a really big time because it was also the first time the nutrition facts label was being changed since the 1980s. So there was a lot being like added and a lot of kickback or pushback from the food industry with what was being suggested. The food industry was very much against the added sugar line being added to the food, to the nutrition facts label. So you have all of these huge lobbyists that are going against, being like, no, they don't need that. No, they don't need that. Because when I started as a dietitian, I could only tell a person's added sugar intake by using a software analysis to take a person's food intake. It was like a very expensive one that we had, and it took a person's total sugar and then divided it out into the added sugar, and then I'd print a person their report and say, like, here's where you need to really cut back. But then when they went to the grocery store, they couldn't actually implement, like, they had to just look at the ingredient list, and then based on how close sugar was to the front of the ingredient list was the only way that they could really know how much added sugar they had in their diet,
right,
because the industry was so against the transparency around how much added sugar was in the food.
Wow.
So when I was there in 2014, right before the 2015 dietary guidelines were being released, they had a public hearing where they invited to the NIH basically like the top people from different lobbies. So there was probably 70 people that were there that were giving public oral testimony to the Dietary Advisory Committee. And there was, of those people, a representative there from the American Beverage Association, from the National Confectioners Association, which used to be the American Candy Association, the Sugar Association, which is separate, the Corn Refiners Association, the National Association of Margarine Manufacturers, McDonald's Inc., the Dannon Company, the United States Potato Board, the American Meat Institute Foundation, a number of different dairy councils and institutions. About 70 people that were given 2 to 3 minutes to speak on behalf of the food or beverage that they were there to represent and why it should be included in the guidelines, or not excluded at least. And of all of those people, there was one dietitian and one doctor that were independently there testifying about the importance of plant-based guidelines. That's what they were there for.
Wow.
So that's the influence that the Dietary Advisory Committee was receiving as far as like the urgency and the important things to include. And then they formulate their recommendations, and then there's a number of days that anyone can provide public comments. So most of the public comments are coming from the lobbyists that know how to work the system and that have paid a ton of people to be like, oh no, we see that you're trying to decrease added sugar to 6%. Here's why you can't do that. There's not enough research around this. They weaponize the research to be like, no, you can't do that, because I mean, I'm assuming that if they don't have enough research, there's going to be lawsuits because it impacts their industry so much. So this was really the moment where I was like, wow, the food industry is setting America's nutrition agenda that's causing us to get sicker, fatter, more depressed, more infertile at an alarming rate, stealing vitality from our kids, causing us to die younger, all for the sake of profit. It's like all for the sake of profit. Millions of Americans are killing themselves every single day with their food choices, and they're completely unaware of the fact that they're doing it to themselves when they're loading their carts and their plates with these foods that are exactly like you said, addictive and filled with refined grains, with added sugar, with artificial flavors, with food dyes, with pesticides, with preservatives, with all of these things that don't belong in our food system. And then you have the National Confectioners Association at the NIH saying sugar should be eaten in moderation because people are stressed and they deserve joy in their life.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.